Network Dojo.
Moving on to our next section here. This section is talking about Prime infrastructure, the MSE, the CMX. But first off, we're going to be focusing on Prime for a little bit. But this being the first video in this section, let's take a look at the blueprint. So here would be the blueprint for section number 6, configure, troubleshoot, PI, and MSE/CMX. It's about 12% of the overall exam. So again, it's more of a medium to smaller size section here. So these first numbers are all PI related things. So management of PI. We have basic operations like templates and maps, high availability, which kind of to me is a little bit more management side of things. Reports, a number of different things under there. Jobs, which are reoccurring tasks within Prime. Some basic security type things. Then we have the CMX MSE type stuff, management, and then all the different services provided by these boxes and the communications protocol there. And finally, integration of ICE with PI. All right, but this video we're going to be talking about details and administration of the Prime infrastructure server itself. So most people are going to run the VM, PI as a VM inside of ESX, and there's different sort of sizes of deployments, which then support different numbers of devices and clients and different things like that. Used to talk about how many devices and clients were supported under each level. We haven't seen questions about these since 3.0 and on, so I'm not going to talk about those anymore. There is also a physical appliance for very large needs. It outpaces even the largest virtual machine deployment specs in this version of code, which is 3.2. But on the VM side, it's installed with an OVA file. But regardless of whether we talk virtual servers or physical servers, there's a setup wizard that gets everything up and running. So basically, we're programming things in there like what's the all the network information, IPs and default gateways, DNS servers, and all that type of stuff, as well as some users. Another one of the things that's defined during this setup is the HA status of the server. Will it be a part of an HA pair? Will it be the primary? Will it be a secondary? And as far as I understand it, this is kind of locked in during the initial setup, and we can't alter this post-setup. I believe, at least that's what I understand so far about it. So all these things are, we get it up and running on the network. We define the HA role. Now it's up and running. At that point, everything else pretty much is done inside the GUI. There is a CLI. You can SSH to the box and do some basic type of connectivity things. Other actions like installing certs and stuff like that's done in the CLI, but all the normal management and manipulations of devices and configurations, that's done in the GUI from there on out. So getting access into the PI server, that's where management users come into play. We do have separate databases for CLI users as well as for GUI users on the box. So when I log into a CLI session, SSH into it, or a console onto the server, the credentials I'm putting there are CLI credentials, which are stored in the CLI. Whereas when I log into the GUI, those are GUI credentials that are stored in the GUI database, I guess, inside there. There is no default CLI user. That's one of those things defined on the initial setup, but there is a default administrative GUI account, and that's called root. So that's what we start off with, root, and the password's defined on the initial setup. So there's no default password there. And then when we log in, we can obviously create more local management users, but any management user, what their rights are granted through group assignments. So creator user, we assign it to one or more groups. Those groups define what you're allowed to do on the server. And there is a top level group called root that the root user is assigned to, but the only user allowed to be in the root group is root. And so any other user is going to be in some sort of a non-root type group. So when we log into the GUI, we have local accounts at the most basic level, but then we can also leverage Radius and or TACACS to allow us to get access into the box as well. If we do turn on Radius or TACACS support, those would be done first. So when I put in credentials, it'll always reach out to the Radius server, or it'll always reach out to the TACACS server first. And then we would recurse down to local accounts if, number one, we turn on fallback, because that's an option you have to turn on. And then number two, usually we fall back either if the external servers are not responding, or there's another option on the fallback to say, even if we have a failure, like I put in an unknown username password, then it would fall back to local there. And so the question then becomes, do I want to use local accounts always if it's not found under Radius or TACACS? Or do I only want to use local accounts if Radius or TACACS is actually not responding? But regardless of what you choose for that fallback option, or even if you don't turn on fallback at all, the root account can always log in. You can never lose access because of this as long as you have that root account. And if you ever lose your password for the root account, you can get into the CLI and actually reset it. So you should always be able to log in locally with that root account. The question will be, are other local accounts able to log in? So when we get a response from a TACACS or Radius request, those responses must include usually three things. There's kind of three categories of entities that determine what rights we get when we're on a box. So one is the role, and the role maps to groups. So just like a local user is mapped to groups, the role essentially says what groups should this Radius or TACACS user essentially get assigned to. And then there's going to be virtual domains, which we'll talk about in a minute, but virtual domains control what you can see in the box. Not what you can do, but what you can actually see. And then usually multiple tasks. And the tasks actually say, you can do this thing, you can do that thing, you can do this other thing. And so tasks are usually related to what the role would grant. If you ever look in the groups, which is what the role references, the groups just have, a list of all the things that you could do, and some boxes are checked and some boxes are not checked. So that they tell you what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. So the tasks are really which boxes are checked. So the role and the tasks sort of overlap with each other a little bit. The reason I have the little asterisk next to tasks is that on the Radius side of things, you can actually omit calling out tasks and just call out a role and one or more virtual domains. And in that case, you inherit the rights of the role as it's locally configured on the box. Whereas I believe when we start advertising tasks, the tasks advertised by Radius or TACACS ultimately say what you can do, what you can't do. And I don't know if the role really makes as big of a difference with that. Maybe there's certain use cases where it does, but by and large, we're limited based off of the tasks that we say that we're allowed to do. And again, the tasks are like the individual actions you can take on the PI server. With TACACS, I believe we have to call it the tasks, but Radius, we can omit them and use the role to assign all of our rights and privileges. So you have to have a role. You have to have at least one virtual domain. You can have many, but you have to have at least one. And then tasks on the Radius side are optional, and I believe on the TACACS side they're required. Now, there's an interesting kind of behavior when it comes to using Radius or TACACS-based authentications in conjunction with also having local users in Prime. So let's say that I have a local account named Jeff. And I also have a Radius or a TACACS account named Jeff, and I'm configured to use Radius or TACACS. I'll just say Radius for simplicity's sake. So we're configured to use Radius-based authentications. All right, I log into the PI server with the account Jeff. We reach out to the Radius server, validate my credentials against Radius. Radius responds with some results. Now, if there is a local account on a local management account, also called Jeff, on the PI server, that local account actually determines what rights I have. And so as far as I can tell, the rights referenced by the Radius response or the TACACS response sort of become ignored, and I get the rights of the local account with the same name. And that's by design. So I'll show you an example of why that's kind of a good thing here. So I suppose I should actually open up Prime here. So let's jump into Prime. log in with that root account. So Prime's at a fairly blank config right now. That's the only admin account I have. I don't really have anything else going on here. But we have users roles in AAA is where all this management authentication type stuff is configured. So certain groups have extra configs along them. So let's say that I was going to create a new user. I'll create that Jeff user here. And so, there's a username. There's a password that goes along with it. And let's say that I'm going to give myself lobby ambassador rights. So certain groups unlock an additional tab of configuration that then have a bunch of settings. So there's a bunch of lobby ambassador settings to control. In this case, it's for creating guest accounts on controllers. That's the point of the lobby ambassador. Create local guest accounts on our controllers. We can't, through a radius response, advertise these settings. We can advertise roles, we can advertise virtual domains, and we can advertise the individual tasks that a role would normally associate, but it can advertise lobby ambassador settings. And so if I want to log in with external credentials, but have these lobby ambassador settings apply to that user that I just did a radius auth against, that's where that matching thing. So I log in. When this happens, when we have the account both on radius or TACACS and local, the credentials are always validated against radius or TACACS. So it's irrelevant what my credentials are locally here because I'm not leveraging the local credentials. But when I get the response back with a success, we sort of ignore the extra junk outside of the success from radius or TACACS, and we take all of the permissions from the local account. So the permissions of the local account apply, the credentials of the external account are all that matters. So radius or TACACS will either send back a success with a bunch of extra junk that we ignore, or a deny, in which case we wouldn't be able to log in. But if it sends back the success, we ignore the extra junk and take all of the settings from the local account. And so you just have to be careful that if you do have a local account, that it doesn't match an external account unless you want this functionality to actually happen. Otherwise, you might accidentally grant rights that you weren't intending to grant, because the rights of the local account are what actually are applied. All right, another thing that we'll talk about is single sign-on. So again, this is another management type authentication mechanism here. So pretend that we have multiple different PI servers throughout our organization. Rather than having to manage, potentially credentials across all these different servers, we can support single sign-on, which allows us, I believe, to just pop back and forth. We log in once, and then we can pop back and forth, like cross-launching pages between different servers without having to re-log in again on every new server that we pop over to. At least that's my understanding of what single sign-on is. So basically what happens is one of the prime infrastructure servers can be the single sign-on server, and the other prime infrastructure servers essentially link up to it. So I believe, when you log into one, it interfaces with the single sign-on server that validates it and then creates a session that can be, moved between the other PI servers. Again, if I understand this correctly. You can also have other external SSO servers, like there's a higher level, I can't remember the name of it, but another Cisco server that can manage multiple PI servers. That can be your SSO as well. But I guess for this to be supported, one of the caveats with this, each prime infrastructure server needs to have its own certificate, which it should. Doesn't matter whether it's a self-signed certificate or a CA-signed certificate, but the common name in the certificate needs to match its fully qualified domain name in DNS. So I guess there's a check against that. And so as long as every server within the SSO structure has a cert with a CN equals this FQDN, we're good to go. And that should be on the SSO server as well as all the SSO client PI servers. Okay, virtual domains. We referenced this. Let's talk about virtual domains in a little bit more context. So while your group says what types of actions you can take within Prime, the virtual domain controls what you have visibility into in terms of devices, your controllers, your access points, what maps can you see. And so there's a root domain that has visibility to everything on the server, or we can create other virtual domains that only can see these devices and these maps. And so if me as a management user am assigned to this other virtual domain, when I look at my inventory of devices, I'll probably see a subset of the devices. And when I go to look at maps, I see a subset of the maps. And so that means I can't see information about these other things that aren't in my virtual domain. I can't manipulate them at all. And so it restricts the scope of what I can impact within Prime. But again, my group membership says, for what I can see, what can I do with these, and which pages can I get access to as a user within PI. Things like reports are going to be influenced by virtual domains. So when we get to reports, we'll see that reports are associated with a virtual domain. So if I run a report in the root virtual domain, it would be able to pull data from every device across everywhere. Whereas if I have a report in some other virtual domain that might only have a handful of devices, it only can access the data about those handful of devices. So if I'm looking at busy clients, or if I'm doing an inventory report, I see data based off of the subset of what the virtual domain shows. And so that can be very helpful in terms of controlling the scope of your reports. Users can be assigned to multiple virtual domains, but they can only be looking at one at a time. And so what happens is you can just, in the menu up here, I would be able to come into virtual domain and see, okay, here are all the virtual domains I can access. I can just say, okay, let's flip to this virtual domain now. And then I would see Prime through the restrictions of what's included in that virtual domain. And so if you are in more than one virtual domain, you can pop back and forth between them.